If your hips are super tight and maybe that tightness is creeping up into your lower back or down into your legs, I want to take you through a hip mobility and hamstring flexibility workout. I'm Valerie Brown of Flexible Strength, and this is a beginner routine. So all you'll need is your own body weight, but we will need 2 yoga blocks. We're going to jump into it right away, starting down on the mat with an exercise called a segmented 90-90. This is one of my favorite ways to start peeling open the hips. So we're going to place our knees out to the side at about a 45-degree angle. Our hands are going to support our body behind our back, and I really want you to pull your toes up towards your knees. This is going to help keep your knees protected as we move our knees from side to side. Now we're going to lower our knees all the way over to the right side. Now I want you to imagine that your hip is like a suction cup. So draw the head of the femur into the joint. You'll feel the muscles around the hip joint starting to work. Dig your left heel into the ground and start using all of the muscles around that left hip joint to move the left knee while keeping that right knee down on the ground. Keep that right knee down on the ground as long as possible. When you can't keep that right knee down any longer, then it can come off the ground. This position is called our bear sit. Now I want you to keep this right knee back as much as you can. Start pushing that left knee down towards the ground. When that left knee is down to the ground, use all of the muscles around your right hip joint to move your right knee until your right knee touches the ground. Then we go back. Draw that right femur back into the joint, just like it's a suction cup. Use all of the muscles around the right hip joint to move your right knee. Keep your left knee down as long as possible. When you can't keep that left knee down any longer, it can come off the ground. Now I'm using my glutes to pull my knees a little bit farther apart. I'm going to start pushing my right knee down towards the ground. I'm going to use all the small muscles around my left hip joint to move my left knee. Let's go back and forth one more time. Dig your left heel in the ground, draw the left femur into the joint, using all the small muscles around the hip joint, keeping that right knee back as long as you can. And in this bear sit, I'm pulling my knees as far apart as I can. I start pushing my left knee down. I'm using all the muscles around that right hip joint to move the right leg. So what we're trying to get right now is each leg to move independently, and we're trying to get all of those small muscles around the hip joint working. Sometimes we just need to wake them up and engage them. All right. Then we're going to come down to a side lying position. So in a side lying position, we're going to get a slightly bigger range of motion in our hips. We started waking them up with our segmented 90-90s, and now we're going to go a full hip car. So in a side lying position, kind of like a fetal position with my knees directly in front of my hips, I'm going to rest my ear on my bicep. I want to keep my hips and shoulders stacked, so we don't want to be facing towards the ceiling or the sky. So bring your chest forward, place your top hand on the ground in front of you. Then this top leg, we're going to lift it straight up so our femur is parallel to the ground. Now I want you to squeeze right in your hip flexor to bring your knee a little bit towards your chest. Now we're going to imagine there's a string pulling your knee up towards the ceiling as much as you can using the outer glute. So this is called hip abduction. When you're as high as you can go without letting yourself roll backwards, turn the top of the femur inwards. So this is called hip internal rotation. Now you want you to think about keep your knee high as you reach your knee just slightly behind your hip. Not too far that we arch our lower back. So when our knee is just slightly behind our hip, we'll start to feel more glutes, feel a little bit of hamstring. Then we continue following the shape of our hip. So we start lowering our knee down towards the ground until our femur is parallel to the ground. And then we pulling it back through. That's one. Squeeze in that hip flexor area. So this is hip flexion. You're imagining there's a string pulling your knee up towards the ceiling. You'll feel this outer hip working. Turn the top of the femur inwards. Hip internal rotation. Keep your knee at that height. So your knee slightly behind your hip. And then when your knee is slightly behind your hip, you can lower your knee till your femur is parallel to the ground and bring it back through. So what this exercise is doing, we are moving our femur within the hip joint in the biggest range of motion without going into any areas of pain. What this does is it helps to keep our joint healthy because it's moving synovial fluid around the joint, but it's also helping us maintain our range of motion. Let's reverse. So this time, reach that knee just slightly behind your hip. You'll feel your hamstrings and glutes. Lifting knee up towards the ceiling, and it goes up and forward because that's the shape of our hip. Back to our hip abduction. And then we're going through hip flexion. Feel your hip flexor. And then we repeat 2 more times. So this hip car just means a controlled articular rotation. We're moving our hip joint through its biggest pain-free range to help keep the joint healthy, and so that helps us maintain that range. We'll do one more. What we're trying to do is move our hip joint independent of the rest of our body. So as we're doing this, we're trying to not let our lower back arch or round. Just the hip joint. Let's go to the other side. The slower we go, the better. Okay, so we're starting in our sideline position. Hips are stacked, shoulders are stacked, knees are directly in front of our hip. We're going to place our hand in front of our body. So now as we go on this side, I want you to focus on your core. Make sure we're not arching or rounding our lower back. We just want the hip to move. That's it. If we can get all of our joints to move on their own very well, then our whole body will move better. So first part, we go through hip flexion. You should feel your hip flexor. Imagine there's a string pulling your knee up towards the ceiling. Hip abduction. Turn the top of the femur inwards. Hip internal rotation. Going through hip extension. Just knee slightly behind the hip. It's not too far. You might notice if you really try and reach your knee really far behind your hip, you'll do a lot of arching of your lower back, and that's not what we want. We're just trying to get our hip moving well on its own, and that's ultimately how we get our hips unstuck. We need to sometimes we have to reteach our body. We go in reverse. Reteach our body how to move. So we're lifting our knee up towards the ceiling. It's up and forward into hip abduction, going through back hip flexion. Think about using the glutes to extend the hip. Make sure we're not arching our lower back as we do so. Knee is up and forward because that's the shape of our hip. This is abduction, hip flexion. Let's do one more. Hip extension, abduction, hip flexion, and back to the start. Come into a seated position. We're going to grab your yoga block. What I want you to do is I want you to sit one hip on the yoga block, and the other yoga block will go in front of your knee. So we're in this 90-90 position. Perhaps you're familiar with this 90-90 position. So in a 90-90 position, my back leg is bent at about a 90-degree angle. This front knee is bent at about a 90-degree angle. It's really, we're less focus on the back leg, more focus on the front leg with this particular exercise. We're going to work on hip external rotation in the piriformis. So this front knee, make sure that it is bent at 90 degrees or greater. We'll have a really difficult time if this heel is close to this back leg. So we want to have 90 degrees or greater. Align this front knee with the midline of your body. Now, to really access hip external rotation in the piriformis, it's going to be on the other leg right here. We want to keep our body very, very straight. So we don't want to round our lower back. So I like to imagine that my body is just a pair of scissors. One blade of the scissors being my upper body, the other blade of the scissors being my femur, fulcrum of movement being the hip joint. So we're going to place our hands on the ground in front of us, get really tall through our spine, and then we're going to think about sinking our body weight to the back of that hip as we're trying to close this pair of scissors. The other way I like to think about it, if you have your hands on your pelvic bones, you're trying to tilt it forward just until you start feeling a stretch in your glutes. And oftentimes you don't have to go that far and you feel a really, really great stretch. We're going to hold this position and just we're going to breathe into it. So the secret with feeling this stretch is really think about sinking your weight into the back of that hip. It's not about reaching our chest as forward as much as we can. It's actually think about sinking your weight backwards. Now, once you've found a gentle stretch, it should be in the back of your right hip, you're going to push your right ankle down into the floor as if you're trying to rotate it underneath your right knee. You should feel your glute muscles working. You're going to push down for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop pushing as that muscle relaxes. Tilt your pelvis a little bit more forward and feel a slightly more intense stretch. And you're going to pause here. So we're not going for a super duper intense stretch right now, maybe like a 6 out of 10. We want to give our body a chance to relax and open up. If we're always chasing very intense stretches, sometimes it makes our body like tighten up and it's harder to access a greater range. So make sure we're breathing. Let's push our ankle down into the ground again for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop pushing down. Now tilt your pelvis a little bit more forward. Think about getting long through the crown of your head. You're just trying to close this angle between your body and your leg. And again, 6, maybe 7 out of 10 intensity. Let's go one more time. Push your ankle down into the floor. You'll feel your right glute working for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop pushing. Tilt your pelvis a little bit more forward. This third one is going to feel a little bit more intense as we're getting closer to our end range. But again, it's nothing near, it's not a 9 or a 10, it's probably a 7. And then we're going to come up. Then we're going to go to the other side. I'm just going to show you on this side so you can see what it looks like. So if I'm switching sides, I'm going to set my legs, my front leg is bent at 90 degrees, back leg is also bent at 90 degrees. First step, I'm aligning my leg with my midline. I'm going to get really long through my spine. And then I'm going to imagine I'm closing a pair of scissors. One blade of the scissors up my upper body, the other blade of the scissors be my femur. Fulcrum of movement is hip joint. So I'm just trying to close this angle, making it smaller. The goal is not to necessarily bring chest down to my knee. The goal is to close this angle, and I feel starting to feel stretch right here. When I start to feel the stretch, I'm going to pause. We're going to take a couple breaths. Then we're going to do a couple pails. So we're going to push our ankle down into the mat. When I start pushing it down, I start feeling my glute working. I'm only pushing down with 30 to 40% of my strength for 5, 4, 3, 2, Stop pushing. As the muscle relaxes, we can take advantage of that muscle relaxation and get a little bit deeper into that stretch. So think about closing that angle a little bit more. It's only going to change by 5 to 10 degrees. It's not going to change by very much. Push your ankle down again for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop pushing. Close that angle a little bit more. Pause there. And we'll push down one more time for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop pushing and close that angle a little bit more. By the last round, we don't get very much change because we're at end range. Take a couple of breaths to let our body know that we are safe here in this range of motion. All right, so that is hip external rotation and the piriformis. Now we work a little bit on hip internal rotation. So we're going to start in a supine position, which means on our back. Grab your yoga block. You're going to stack your knees over your hips. So bend your knees to 90 degrees, stack them over your hips, crush a yoga block between your knees. Now for this one, I want you to maintain the natural curvature of your spine. So if you have a deep curve in your lower back, I want you to maintain that space between your lower back and the floor. So hip internal rotation is turning our femurs inward. So I want you to drive your elbows down into the ground. We're going to crush that yoga block as much as we can. I want you to crush as hard as you can. Now turn the tops of both femurs inwards until you feel these outer hip working. For 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Relax, rotate them back to the start. Drive your elbows down, brace through your core. Do not start rounding your lower back into the ground. Just start crushing that yoga block, turning top of both femurs inwards for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Relax again. Drive those elbows down, brace through your core, crush that yoga block, turn both femurs inwards. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Should be shaking. We have 2 more here. Elbows down, brace your core, crush the block, turn both femurs inwards as much as you can. Get those outer hips shaking harder, harder, harder. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's do one more. Crush those elbows down, brace through your core, crush your yoga block as much as you can. Get those outer hips shaking. Go for 500% of your strength. 4, 3, 2, 1. Whew. Awesome. Hips are awakened up. So we started with ground-based hip mobility, but another way to move our hips is when we're standing. So on the ground, we're moving our femurs around a pelvis that is stable. Now we're going to move our pelvis around femurs that are stable. So we're going to start with standing good morning. It's nice and simple. Feet are going to be about shoulder width apart. Keep your knees straight, hands on your hip bones. I want you to imagine that same thing as we're closing a pair of scissors. So one blade of the scissor is my upper body, the other blade of the scissor is my legs. Fulcrum of movement is still my hips. So it looks like this. We're trying to tilt our pelvis forward, closing the pair of scissors. So notice in this good morning, I reach my hips, they actually travel backwards so I don't fall over. Ideally, my belly button is over my feet at all times. And then back up. So this is just a regular good morning. So I'm keeping my knees straight. I'm feeling my pelvis tilt, or they're rotating over both femurs at the same time. Stopping point is when I feel a stretch in my hamstrings. We're going to go for 5 here. So slowly feeling that pelvis rotate. Another way to know is if you're starting to round your lower back. I like to place my fingers between my hips and my lower rib cage. And you'll notice if this distance is getting smaller, you're starting to round through your lower back. So we don't want to let this distance change at all. So we want all the movement to come from the hips. So if you do notice that you're starting to round your back, no problem, just don't lower any farther. As your mobility and flexibility improves, you'll be able to lower more and more. All right. So that is two-legged good mornings. Now we're in for a challenge. So we're gonna bend one knee, step that foot slightly, slide it slightly behind your back. We're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna do on one leg. Exact same thing. So we're gonna shift our weight over towards this left leg. Keep your nose, knee, middle toe in alignment. We're still gonna maintain this normal spinal curvature, so we're not letting our lower back round. If you need to, thumb and finger between your rib cage and hips. This leg stays straight, and we're hinging on one leg. So now we're trying to pivot our pelvis mostly over this leg that is remaining straight. Stopping point, again, full hamstring. We're going to pause there, and then we're going to think about pushing that foot down into the ground to bring our hip all the way back up. So now we are strengthening our hamstrings in a lengthened position. And this is how we improve our flexibility. We strengthen it at its weakest position right here. Pause, dig your foot down, and use your hamstring to pull yourself back up. Now, if you are having a lot of trouble with balance, just go ahead and hold on to a wall, a chair, whatever's handy. And the more you practice, the more you'll improve your balance. The other thing that I'm really focusing on is I'm keeping my big toe pressed into the ground. That's super, super important. We don't want to let our big toe come off the ground. We'll really have trouble with balance. This is our last one. Feeling a stretch in that hamstring and back up. Let's go to the other side. So feet together, bend your knee, slide that leg back just a little bit. So we're going to keep this base leg straight, and we're just closing a pair of scissors, keeping our nose, knee, and middle toe in alignment. As I'm hinging, notice my hip is reaching back so that I don't fall over. I'm keeping about 80% of my weight in this leg that is staying straight. And I'm hinging until I feel a stretch in my hamstrings. I'm going to pause. I'm going to push that foot down to bring my body back upright. Go for 5 repetitions. So training single leg movements trains biases a little bit more hip internal rotation, but we are rotating our pelvis over a femur that's not moving. So this exercise improves hip internal rotation, hip mobility, and hamstring flexibility. Come down to the floor. We have some hip flexor stuff. Whew. Everybody's favorite. So what I want you to do, you're going to place your hands on the floor on either side of your hip. Pull your toe up towards your knee. Draw the head of the femur into the joint again, just like your hip is a suction cup, suctioning it in there. And we're trying not to lean back, and we're going to lift that leg off the ground. Hold it for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Down, draw it in, and lift. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Draw it in, lift. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you're getting cramping, sorry. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It does get better. Cramping just means that the muscles are not quite strong enough yet. And that, with practice, the cramping will become less intense. All right. The other suggestion I would say, if you are cramping a lot, you want to lift just below the point of crampage, so don't lift it as high, and do it a little bit slower. If you just try and lift your leg quickly, I find they cramp a little bit more. So a little bit more slowly. Other side, pulling your toe up toward your knee, knee towards your hip, hands to the ground, and lift. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Draw it in, lift. If you're having trouble getting off the ground, you can lean back a little bit. It's not really about how high you get, it's about how strict you can keep the movement, because the more you lean forward, the less you're going to be able to lift your leg off, and it's going to be a lot more intense. This is our last one. Awesome. We have another round of single leg good mornings. Now, this time with your single leg good mornings, we have our feet together, shoulder width, bend one knee, slide that leg back. Now I want you to get that feeling of pulling yourself down. So that hip flexor exercise we just did, try and get that same feeling in your hip. It's going to keep your hip a lot more stable, and it's going to help you get a little bit more stretch in your hamstrings to help improve hamstring flexibility. So nose, knee, middle toe in alignment. We're imagining we're a pair of scissors. One blade of the scissors our upper body, the other blade of the scissors our leg. Fulcrum of movement as our hip joint. So I want you to imagine you're doing like a hip flexor lift off like we just did on the ground. So we're going to pull ourselves into the good morning. So we're keeping our quads and our hip flexors engaged. We're reaching our hip back until we feel a stretch in our hamstrings. Push your foot down to bring your hip up. Second round, pulling yourself down. Pull, 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 pull until we feel a stretch. Making sure we're not arching our lower back or rounding. If you are, no problem. The more you practice, the more you'll be able to dissociate hip movement from lower back movement. When our hips are really stuck, oftentimes the lower back is trying to do hip stuff. But the more we practice just really trying to get our hips to move independent of everything else, the easier it will become. And this is our last one. So we don't necessarily worry about how far you get down. As long as you're feeling that your pelvis rotating over your femur, you're starting to feel that stretch, that is awesome. That is progress. Feet, hip distance, bend one knee, sending it back. Closing our pair of scissors. We're trying to get the feeling of, basically we're doing a hip flexor lift off. So using our quads and our hip flexors to pull us into the stretch, and we're going to feel a lot more stable. Keeping our nose, knee, middle toes in alignment. So right now I'm just feeling my pelvis rotate over my femur, and I keep rotating it. My tailbone now pointed backwards, so I feel a stretch in my hamstrings, pushing my foot down to bring myself back up. And this is our last one. Awesome. Guess what? We're gonna do hip flexors one more time. If they cramp the first time, usually the second time, it isn't so bad. Sometimes it's the first time we start hip flexor work, they protest a little bit. So sitting up nice and tall, pulling our toes towards our knees, drawing the head of the femur into the joint, and lift and hold each time for 5 seconds. And down. Next one, drawing it in, lift. If you want to make it more challenging, you simply lean forward. And you notice you won't be able to get as high, but it'll be more intense. Awesome. Going to the other side. All right, up nice and tall. Remember, you can lean back or you can lean forward, depending on where you are in your hip flexor strength. Hip flexor strength is a game changer, the complete game changer for hip mobility and strength. 3. We'll do 2 more after this. And last one. Awesome. We just finished off. Nice little easy finisher for you. I'm so proud of you for making it this far. So you're going to grab your yoga blocks and you're going to place it on the floor in front of you. You're going to stand with your feet about hip distance apart. We're going to max out our good morning, our 2-legged good morning. So we're hinging as much as we can until you feel a stretch in your hamstrings. Then I want you to place your hands on your yoga blocks. What we're going to do, we're going to push our hands into those yoga blocks, and you'll feel your core muscles working, you'll feel your quads, and you'll feel your hip flexor. So we're going to push in for 10 seconds. You're going to push down. So start pushing for 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Relax. Push down again for 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Push again. Let's go. Push as hard as you can. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ready? Remove those yoga blocks. And then we're going to do a forward fold just as much as you can. And we're going to breathe. Just for another 10 seconds. And that is it for our hip rotation and hamstring beginner workout. I hope you enjoyed this workout. Drop any questions or comments below if you have any specific requests for additional workouts. Also drop them below, and I look forward to seeing you next time.